Welcome everyone to this session on Russia and international relations. The CIC, as for those of you who do not know about our CIC, we were founded in 2016. It was conceived by some of the city's accomplished industrialists and professionals with an objective of creating an intellectual hub for the city's intelligentsia to meet, share, discuss, and evolve transformational ideas. The CIC aspires to be a spa for the mind and the soul. We have about close to 300 members. The center regularly invites accomplished Indian and global personalities to share experiences and vision in their respective area of expertise. The center has a diverse and strong membership of professionals, entrepreneurs, academicians, environmentalists, administrators, media persons, and historians who are dedicated towards contributing to shaping the economic, social, and political gradient of our country. Since its inception in 2016, we have hosted about 134 events, and this is the 135th event of the CIC. It is my pleasure to invite all the audience to this panel discussion. The panelists as are on the screen before you. We have Ambassador Venkatesh Varma, we have Nandan Krishnan, and Shri Anup Vadhavan. I hand over now to Shri R.K. Raghavan to introduce the panelists and set the ball rolling. I'm sure we will have a great session going forward.
Thank you, Chandramouli. Good evening to Dina Kotari, Mr. Chandramouli of CIC, and a host of distinguished panelists, and a host of others who are watching this. What looks to be a very interesting and exciting program. It's my pleasure and privilege to introduce the three panelists. First, Ambassador Varma, a good friend of mine, was born in 1961, and he holds an MPhil degree from International Studies Department of the JNU. Then he was in the IFS from 1988 till 2021. He has the distinction of working both at the External Affairs Minister's Office and the PMO. He was Indian ambassador to several countries, including the Conference on Disarmaments, Geneva, Spain, and Russian Federation until October 21. He has the distinction of having had 3 separate spells in Moscow, which makes him an expert in Russian affairs, and we look forward to the wisdom of the knowledge which he acquired in Moscow, which still remains a mystique among many of us who have not been to Russia or had anything else to do with Russia. Now, he has 3 separate postings in Moscow, then vast experience in India's security and defense policies, including nuclear, missile, and space programs. And most importantly, he is the first recipient of the well-known SK Singh Award, himself a distinguished foreign service officer, for excellence in IFS. Now you know what valuable background knowledge which Ambassador Venkatesh has acquired, and he's happily settled down in Hyderabad, and I had the privilege of meeting him the first day he took over in Moscow as India's ambassador. I still cherish the kind of warmth and hospitality which he extended to me. And next is Anup Vadhavan, was in the IAS, started his career in the IAS in 1988, spent 3 decades in the IAS, and established for himself a great reputation for development administration and magisterial excellence. I was first in Uttar Pradesh cadre, then moved over to Uttarakhand. He was lastly Commerce Secretary to the Government of India, and he was served in various ministries in the Government of India, including Economic Affairs, Commerce, and last but not least, the PMO. Handled subjects such as capital markets, foreign trade, WTO, and World Bank. In World Bank, he had a lot to do with water and sanitation processes. He has lectured extensively on economics, finance, regulation, and public service delivery. So how can you have anybody better than Vadavan to enlighten us and what he knows about Russia and what he thinks the future is going to be. Last but not the least, Nandan Muni Krishnan, a very well-known journalist all over the country and parts of the world, distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, New Delhi. Before joining ORF, he was a journalist for 2 decades, initially with the PTI, and he was chief of bureau in Moscow. So he has a fund of knowledge of Moscow. He's an expert on the former Soviet space course, and also he has developed expertise in Indo-Russian relations. He has co-authored and edited books and many monographs, and he has widely published articles which are still spoken about. So welcome to all the 3 panelists, and we are in for some real treat, especially some of us who have only slight knowledge of Moscow, and Moscow is now very much in the news for the Ukrainian crisis, and everybody looks towards Moscow and to find out whether it will maintain peace or it will be aggressive is anybody's guess. Nobody can read Putin's mind, and so we are going to have a real treat of some expertise and knowledge. I hand over the proceedings to Ambassador Varma.
So thank you, sir, and good evening to everyone, and my deep appreciation to Ambassador Raghavan for making the introduction with the Chennai International Center, and I'm delighted that this program has been organized. Congratulations to Mr. Chandramouli for taking over recently the CIC, and very happy to make this participation in this program. And of course, gives me an opportunity to meet my old friends for long years, Mr. Anup Vadavan and Mr. Nandan Krishnan on this program. So it's a coming together of on a very happy note. Let me say that Russia is in the news for several reasons. Russia is very rarely off the news, but this time it is now sort of hogging the headlines. But let me turn back to the end of the year, last year, in December. President Putin made just 2 visits abroad last year because of the COVID pandemic. He didn't travel very much. In fact, he didn't travel at all, except to Geneva to meet President Biden for a bilateral summit in June last year. And on 6th December, he visited India to meet our Prime Minister Muni, in Hyderabad House. It was a 6-hour visit, and these were the only 2 visits that he did last year. So that shows the real importance that President Putin assigns to India and his relationship with Prime Minister Modi. I think that is a good background to keep in mind. Russia has an old connection with Chennai. They've had a consulate for very long years. There is a fantastic story that I've heard about a Tamilian. I forget, I didn't get his full name, who was in the British Indian Army. He was captured in Italy, fighting the Germans in 1943. He was put in a prisoner of war camp in Italy first, and then he was taken to Germany, where he shared the prisoner of war camp with the Soviets. There were Soviet prisoners of war as well. And it is known that the Germans, because they had a very low view, a very antagonistic view of the Soviets, they never used to give them food in the prisoner of war camp. And the food that was given to this person from Tamil Nadu, he used to apparently secretly share his food with people from the army from Russia. And he is still remembered very highly in Moscow. So I think there is a very nice connection out there. Well, just to summarize a few points, Russia is the biggest country in the world, so you can't take it off the map. It is 17.3 million square kilometers. By comparison, India is 3.2. So you can see Russia has borders with 14 countries. With none of the countries it has borders are there natural obstacles. So these borders are always a problem, and this is an issue that is coming up again with respect to Ukraine. India has borders with 7, and as you know, just having 7 countries having borders, our borders are quite troublesome. In comparison, you can see how troublesome the borderlands of Russia are for Russia. Russia has about 193 ethnic nationalities, so quite similar to India. The Soviet collapse in 1991 had a devastating effect on the position of Russia. The first 10 years of Russia in the 1990s was absolutely critical. Everything declined, everything collapsed. There was utter chaos. But the last 20 years, under President Putin's leadership, Russia has consolidated. There's internal stabilization of state structures. There's a rebuilding of the military. There's economic stabilization, and there's a technological revival as well. Russia trades about $750 billion a year. China is their biggest trading partner, but the European Union, in terms of individual countries, the European Union is the biggest trading partner as a group. Russia has followed because of the very unhappy experiences it has had with the external world. The economic crisis in the 1990s, the economic crisis in 2008, the sanctions that were imposed on Russia in 2014 after its takeover of Crimea. Russia has created an economic system that adds to its resilience. And what are the facts and figures for this resilience? Russia is very careful in spending its money. Even during the COVID pandemic, the Russian government was very careful in spending money on health. Of course, they spent, but they did not want to waste money. It has $631 billion in its foreign exchange reserves. Russia has a national wealth fund. Wealth fund means that Russia exports a lot of oil and gas, that any oil and gas, if the price is above $40, the additional dollars that come into the Russian account is put away in a separate fund. And that fund today is about $191 billion. Inflation is low, it is about 5%. Russia expects the economic growth, the IMF expects economic growth in Russia to about 2.5% next year. So it has a low growth equilibrium, but it is resilient to external shocks. There is also a de-dollarization of the Russian economy. Many countries, including India, hold their foreign exchange reserve in dollars. Russia holds only 16% of its foreign exchange reserves in dollars. A lot of it is in euros, in renminbi, or the Chinese currency, and also in Japanese yuan. But also they also hold it in gold. Because of the sanctions, there has been a revival of the Russian economy in certain sectors. Of course, big Russian exports are defense, energy, and natural minerals. But recently, Russia has also become an agricultural superpower, agricultural export superpower. Russia exported only $15 billion worth of arms last year. It exported $30 billion worth of agricultural exports. International stage, Russia occupies a very big position, despite the fact that its economy is only about $1.7 trillion. It is almost about half the Indian economy, but it's much less than the Chinese economy, which is around 16, and 2021, which is the size of the American economy. But in geopolitical terms and in political terms, Russia continues to be very, very important. It is, of course, the second largest nuclear power in the world, along with the United States. It's a member of the Security Council. It is very active, is a permanent member of the Security Council. It's very active in structures such as the BRICS, SCO, RIC, Russia, India, China, the G20, and it's now increasingly important for climate change. Russia has a very strong position, like India, on counterterrorism. It has supported India on very many occasions on fighting, especially the Islamic terrorism that has afflicted Chechnya, Dagestan. They have had a very bad experience. Chechnya is now fully settled. In the 1990s, the Russian army fought two battles. They lost both battles. But now, if you go to Grozny, Grozny is like a mini Dubai. That is a great success story of how Russia has been able to incorporate its minorities to create a new elite and suppress terrorism. So that is something that is very important. Russia has very troubled borders, and we saw this Russian activism in Central Asia, recently in Kazakhstan. And today, of course, there is a big issue with respect to Russia deploying 100,000 troops vis-a-vis NATO and the United States on the borders of Ukraine. Broadly speaking, Russia was very weak over the last 3 decades, but Russia now says that it has become strong enough to protect its interests. Russia feels it is backed into a corner. It has no option but to ask for a new arrangement, a security arrangement, not just with respect to Ukraine, but also in Eastern Europe. And there are talks going on between the United States and Russia. Russia may not get everything that it is asking for, but I think at least there is a turn towards dialogue. Russia has been making these demands for over 20 years. In the last 3 years that I was in Moscow, I heard these demands coming up from Russia all the time. The West, NATO paid no attention. The United States paid no attention. They were, of course, dismissed. But now, once 100,000 troops were deployed on the border, they definitely got their attention. So, of course, this shows 2 lessons, including for us. If you are weak, people don't listen to you. If you are strong, of course, that carries its own weight. I don't think it is Russian objective to engage in war. Actually, it will be a defeat of their strategy if they actually hostilities break out. But they do want that more space be given for Russian interests in Europe. President Putin just visited Beijing. They have very good relations with China. Sometimes it is thought that Russia and China are alliance partners. I don't think that is the case. They're very strong partners, but not alliance members. Russia will never become a junior partner of China. China is a $16 trillion economy. Russia is 1.7. There can never be an equation of equals. And my sense is that Russia will not agree to. They have their own differences which are not publicized, essentially because the Russians are under such great pressure from NATO and the United States. That creates a hurdle to their necessity to make friends with China. Russia has very moderate relations with Pakistan. They do not supply arms to Pakistan. It is one of the big arms suppliers countries in the world, which because of our intervention, in fact, this was something that Prime Minister Modi personally asked President Putin, and it's a personal commitment from President Putin that Russia will not supply arms to lethal arms to Pakistan, and that is held. Relations with India are, of course, in a very even keel. It's one of the very unique relationships in the world, where despite all the changes that have taken place over a very long period of time, the relationship has continued. I think there are 3 broad reasons for this. First reason is, I think there is a convergence of geopolitical interests. This has been always the case. Russia sees India's growth as good for it. India has always looked at Russian growth as essential for a multipolar world. The leadership of both countries has paid particular attention to this relationship. And I just gave you the example of the excellent personal rapport between President Putin and Prime Minister Modi. That again, I think is a very important factor. The third factor, I think, is there's continuing popular sentiment support for relations between India and Russia. Of course, the new generation is having some more general views about India, but I think the older generation is very strongly supportive of relations with India. One of the weak links, we are extremely good in defense, in energy, particularly nuclear energy. The Kudankulam plant in Tamil Nadu, there are 6 nuclear power plants being constructed. 2 are already operational, 2 are already in advanced stage of construction, and 2 more are being initiated for construction. When the whole thing is completed, this will produce more than 8,000 megawatts of power, very essential for the energy security, not only of Tamil Nadu, but all the southern states. And after the end of the civil nuclear deal, Russia has been the foremost amongst the foreign suppliers in building nuclear power plants in India. The space program is also where we have very good cooperation. The Gaganyaan 4 astronauts who will fly into space have been trained in Russia. Similarly, with respect to energy, Russia is a very big energy investor. We have also invested in major terms. Trade has been a big link. It has hovered around an average of $10 billion. And my distinguished colleague, Mr. Vadhavan, has a very good sense of the limitations that we have always faced in expanding trade. But that remains a weak link. Partly it's connectivity, partly it is lack of interest by the business communities, the over dominating role of the government and not enough for private sector interest. But I think slowly this will change. Prime Minister Modi, when he was in Vladivostok in 2019, added the dimension of inter-regional cooperation, getting the regions and the states of India and the regions of Russia to cooperate deeper, and that will add to be a very good driver of relations. But on the whole, we have absolutely no political differences with Russia. In fact, Russia supports us on critical issues, including Kashmir, counterterrorism, our arms supplies. They are with us on very major issues, including on our problem that we have with China and on the Ladakh sector. Russia has continued to with its advanced arms supplies to India. The S-400 is one of the best air defense systems that we have. So this is a very broad overview, and I will be very happy to participate in the discussion. And I would now like to yield the floor to Mr. Vadhavan to make his comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We are indeed very enlightened by your very comprehensive and incisive remarks. So let me try to see what I can say in this context. So, to address the issue directly about the role of Russia, clearly, as Ambassador Varma has brought out, Russia's role in world affairs today is undoubtedly significant and it's hard to ignore. And I think having put its house in order on the economic side, on the military side, and having acquired a very assertive tone in its foreign policy, if you look at Crimea, you look at Syria, and you now look at Ukraine. So with all these factors, I think it has emerged as a formidable counterweight in what was looking like a unipolar world. It seemed at one stage after the Soviet Union collapsed that you'd have a unipolar world in the foreseeable future. And there was also at one stage a feeling that Russia might get absorbed into the Western fold. And I think it was a strategic mistake on the part of the West that they didn't do more to absorb Russia into the Western fold. As Ambassador Verma mentioned, huge economic challenges faced Russia post breakdown of the Soviet Union. And I think Western advice, well-meaning as it may have been, based typically on Western models, caused a lot of economic hardship to the Russians. Then, of course, the Western approach to expanding NATO wasn't exactly the best way to absorb Russia into the Western fold. So I think there were huge strategic mistakes. Russia could have been absorbed into the Western fold. And well, that is now behind us. So now we see Russia emerging as, in a way, a Soviet-style power it's re-emerging, and I think that is one of their dreams, to regain the lost glory of the Soviet Union. And of course, the I won't use the word alliance, since Ambassador Verma has uh, defined it as something short of an alliance. So it's the partnership with China, the complementaries that it affords, whether economic or strategic. The fact that the West has again pushed the two into each other's arms, that, and combined with, recent assertiveness, of course, their economic growth has been formidable. Combined with that, President Xi's assertiveness on the strategic side. So this partnership clearly acquires, very formidable strength, and the partnership with China acts as a multiplier in terms of lending weight to this partnership strategically in world affairs. And of course, there are stresses and strains in the Russian and Chinese relationship. I think both sides are very difficult as partners. I think Russia and China, and they have some uh, lack of trust with each other. They have a lot of suspicion in their relationship. So that, underlying those underlying stresses are there. But I think, given the sort of unifying impact of the confrontation with the West, I don't think those stresses will lead to a collapse of that partnership in the near future. And to the extent that partnership remains, it will be a formidable partnership, matching in a sense the West. So what is the sustainability of this partnership? Is it going to, overextend itself economically on military issues and collapse like the Soviet Union? So I think, in a nutshell, my answer to that would be no. If you look at the economic side, Russia is a very, very significant economy, I would say. They have not been able to create a good investment climate, as a result of which they have not achieved their potential. But notwithstanding that, they are a fairly formidable economy, huge natural resources. Of course, they are not tapped again to potential, but that is where I think the complementarity with China comes in. To the extent they are vulnerable on Western demand for Russian gas and oil, to that extent China can fill in the gap. To the extent they're short of, people, they're short of demand as a small population which is shrinking, then China can sort of fill the gap on that score also. So economically, I don't think Russia is going to collapse anytime soon, or overextend itself militarily beyond its means and have a Soviet style collapse. Of course, the other thing we need to remember is that their economic strength today has a private sector underpinning. That private sector underpinning is what distinguished the Soviet Union from the West. The Soviet Union did not have that underpinning of private sector efficiency, whereas the Americans, the Western powers, that was their strength, huge economic strength to match the kind of military expenditures that Russia took, overextending itself. So I don't think that is going to happen to Russia easily. And then, of course, they are complemented by China. China has huge economic strength, very, very highly diversified economy. They dominate major sectors across the globe, whether it is, APIs for pharmaceuticals, whether it is components, whether it is textiles, critical chemicals, rare earths. So name it, and the Chinese dominate huge sectors across the world, of course, and that domination is growing. They had a full-fledged fist fight with President Trump, with tariffs and all kinds of trade war aspects, and they came out unscathed virtually. Their trade surpluses increased, their domination of global value chains in many ways increased. So the Chinese, again, of course, they are vulnerable on certain technology areas. Some critical components they have to buy from Japan, Korea, the US, they are very vulnerable, but they have a single point plan to overcome that vulnerability, which I'm sure they will do given the kind of methods they employ. They will overcome those vulnerabilities. And through sheer domination of various global value chains, they have a countervailing power over the West. The West cannot easily disrupt today economic ties with the Chinese. They will work towards that. They will work towards a situation where the dependence is low, but that will take time. And in the meanwhile, we see that China's interlinkages with neighbors, interlinkages with the world economy, they are growing. RCEP, which happened when these tensions were at their height, it went through. When Australia was virtually in a war-like situation politically with the Chinese, and of course South China Sea is there for all of us to see. They are virtually at war with many of their neighbors. Yet those neighbors have seen their economic interest in increasing ties with China, and RCEP is a demonstration of that. And beyond trade, there is investment. There are huge Chinese investments in its neighbors, in countries with whom, at a political level, there may be differences. So even on the economic side, I don't see things collapsing. Notwithstanding Western sanctions will not be able to go beyond a point. To a large extent, the Chinese and the Russians will fill those gaps, and then they won't go beyond a point because there is counter vulnerability. And I think COVID, in some senses, COVID enhanced the dependence of the rest of the world on Chinese supply. So at one level, there is talk of de-risking supply chains post-COVID. There's a talk of the China plus one approach where investments will shift to third countries and de-risk the supply chains. But then if you see what is the quantum of this shift, it is minimal. Countries like Vietnam and all have, and India to some extent have attracted investment, but it will happen very slowly. And in the meanwhile, China will consolidate. So I don't see, the prospects of this alliance and the prospects of uh, Russia and China's role in world politics and in the world diminishing in any way uh, in the near future. So these two blocks are, here to stay, and one of them, of course, is reluctant to go the distance. If you see America's stance in Afghanistan, they've been reluctant to go the distance, and that does not augur well for the kind of balance you need in global arrangements. And of course, in some ways, the old balance of terror view, that balance of terror will prevent any of the blocks from overextending itself and doing something really damaging, or go too far in terms of doing something which the other side will not accept. That Cuba type situation, the Cuban Missile Crisis type of situation. The belief was that a balance of terror was there and no side would overplay its hand. But that has been tested. It was tested in Afghanistan by the Russians. Of course, the West responded and they armed the Mujahideen, and but interference or intervention was from a distance. Then, of course, you had Iraq, but I think at that time you had a unipolar world, so it is understandable there was no response from the other side. Then, from the Russian side, you had Crimea. They got what they wanted in Crimea. The West was upset. They did impose sanctions, but not willing to go far enough to deal with the situation. Short of war, many things could have been done. Yeah, the Afghanistan type of interventions could have happened, but did not interfere. South China Sea, China has tested the limits of Western tolerance. They've tested the limits of their neighbors and got away with it. So the balance of terror seems to have been modified, that each side will choose occasions to overstretch themselves, overextend themselves, call the other side's bluff, and then go on to the next arena and see if what you lost in this one, you gain somewhere else. So that again doesn't augur well, for future peace in the world. And of course, Russian aggressiveness in Syria, all those things. So now let me quickly come to India. What are the implications for India? India, of course, as Ambassador Verma said, has in a sense maintained neutrality, and we maintained cordiality with both sides. And of course, it's a challenging uh, sort of goal to achieve, given the fact that the two blocs are highly antagonistic to each other. Maintaining a balance with them is going to be very difficult. And what complicates things is that uh, one of the sides, if you look at Russia with China, then we have some issues with China, which I think, given uh, Russia's alliance now with China, it will certainly, I think, qualitatively impact Russia's willingness to intervene on our behalf at some critical junctures which may arise, not only vis-a-vis China, but maybe even vis-a-vis Pakistan, given Chinese pressure on the Russians, even on behalf of Pakistan. And I think of late, when our differences with China came to the fore, we saw the Russians, adopting a kind of, I'm talking as a layperson, depending on newspapers, we saw the Russians adopting a kind of mediatory approach, a mediatory middle person approach, that, okay, we are not going to take sides in this. It is between you and China. So I'm concerned that given all this, we need meaningful allies. When things come to a crunch, we need meaningful allies. We have very, very formidable adversaries across our border, and we need meaningful allies. So can these two blocs, you look at bloc led by America, bloc led by, I won't say led by Russia, but Russia-China partnership, can they be meaningful allies? Can, for instance, the quality of Russian help to us when required be of the order that it was in 1971? It was of an order which was huge. Will the Americans see their interest in India or South Asia to the extent they see it in South China Sea, to the extent they see it in Taiwan or Japan? Will their sort of intervention when things come to a crunch be of the order, say, it was in the 73 Yom Kippur War for Israel? Of course, maybe that's an exceptional case. But I'm concerned about, how meaningful these alliances are going to be. And so, this brings me to what Ambassador Verma said, that you have to acquire a position of strength. We cannot hope to be bailed out by any of these, links of cordiality that we might have with these two blocs. If something, if an adverse situation develops with China, then I'm sure Russians will try to pacify things, try to mediate, but I'm sure the quality of their support will not be of the kind of order that was there for us earlier in 71. And I think that might be true even in case of some adversarial situation with Pakistan. So I don't know. I'm willing to be corrected by Ambassador Verma. I'm saying all this as a layperson. So clearly, we need to put our house in order. This economic gap with China is absolutely unjustified in terms of our own capacities. 1980, we were somewhere at the same level. We in objective analysis, maybe we had better capacities than the Chinese, but they are now 6 times our per capita income, and the gap is growing geometrically. And you'll see this economic gap has huge strategic and military implications. This economic gap also indicates an economy which has not got its manufacturing act together. We have a manufacturing sector which is unsophisticated, underdeveloped. We have an investment climate which is not attracting investment to the extent we need. And our goals on the strategic side are huge. We are aspiring for, and we need a sophisticated military. We need sophisticated programs, related to missiles and space, all these areas. And that is not compatible with a manufacturing sector that is punching well below its weight. You cannot have a situation where you find it difficult to make a nail cutter, but ultimately you're trying to match the strength of a very, very formidable neighbor in terms of, weaponry and missiles and all those things. So we need to put our house in order, sort out our manufacturing environment, sort out our investment environment. And in principle, we of course have all the ingredients for being as successful as the Chinese, if not more. And it's not a very long period of time. They've done it in 30, 40 years. I'm sure we can, do it at a faster pace. But that I think is going to be the major challenge. And of course, we'll be able to handle the Chinese. I'm confident we'll be able to handle the Chinese. We have sufficient economic strength. We have sufficient strength in our institutions. We have sufficient strength, as was seen in the recent confrontation with them in our armed forces. So I'm sure we'll be able to handle the challenge of China, but it'll become increasingly difficult as the economic gap widens. Wars are going to be fought at a distance. They're going to be fought beyond visual range. It will not be armies in physical proximity of each other fighting the war. Wars are going to be beyond visual range with all kinds of sophistications. And that is when, things will become more challenging unless we put our house in order and are able to measure up to that. So I'll conclude my remarks with that. And my thanks to all of you for patiently listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vadhavan. I will now take over without further ado. I think we've had a very rich panoply of views on Russia, where it stands in the world politically, as well as its economic aspects. Ambassador Varma also enlightened us on some of the elements of the Indo-Russian relationship. So did Mr. Vadhavan. And here I would like to thank both speakers, not only for the light they have shed on the questions that they have highlighted, but also because for a moderator, they've made my task easier, because there are some areas which have been left uncovered. Therefore, allow me to raise some questions to make this a discussion, as well as particularly thankful to Mr. Vadhavan for raising some, I thought, very relevant questions, which are seizing the mind of the Indian people, even the Indian elite, including the strategic community. So without further ado, let me get into the question. And I, of course, would like to start with Ambassador Varma. And my question will not do today with, it will later. The first question will not be dealing with Ukraine, but my first question will be on the impact of the Russia-China relationship on our bilateral relationship with Russia. Mr. Vadhavan raised an interesting point. Will Russia's support for India, which I have no doubt has not wavered, but nevertheless, there is a doubt in people's minds that will Russia's support for India, push comes to shove, be as forthcoming as it was in the past?
Well, thank you. You see, Russia is a country that has revived. But we should also understand that Russia is also a country under great limitations. I specifically mentioned the fact that they have borders with 14 countries. And NATO pressure on Russia has increased in the last 3-4 years. In a sense, it has become almost unbearable for Russia. So Russia is trying to cut its losses by upping the ante tactically, so that it will get an arrangement that is less restrictive in the future. The United States is determined, along with the European allies, to put pressure on Russia. How much, to what extent, we will see. It is a matter of discussion now between the United States and Russia. The United States has a problem in Europe, which is that the United States may want to do a global policy, for example, focus on China, but the small European countries don't leave the United States in peace. They constantly want the United States to be involved more and more in Europe. Partly it is because of the Russia threat, which is not insubstantial. There is a threat that smaller countries in Europe face. But as has been mentioned, the last 30 years, there has been no investment in creating security structures in Europe. And NATO expansion, 5 phases of NATO expansion has only increased the insecurity in Europe. So those set of countries have their own set of problems. Because of the US sanctions and European sanctions, Russia has to have outlets elsewhere. Despite even today, Europe is the biggest trading partner for Russia. But increasingly, more and more of the oil and gas is going towards China. China is a very big market. Russia cannot do without the very big market for its machinery, for its energy resources, for its mineral timber. If the Russians don't sell timber to China, the Chinese will smuggle, illegally they will smuggle timber from Siberia and take it to China. So that is a threat that the Russians also face. The weak hinterland of Russia, which was originally in the old days used to be Central Asia, the biggest threat for Russian influence in Central Asia is not America today. After America has withdrawn from Afghanistan, it is China. You know, we have a border problem with China. Russia has a hinterland problem with China, and that will play out in the future. But Russia is careful not to pick up a fight on both sides. They want to take on the pressure on Russia from the West, while they have to accommodate to some extent vis-a-vis China. But look at the arms supplies from Russia to major countries in our part of the world. All countries, major countries which have a problem with China: Vietnam, India, Myanmar, increasingly. Who is the biggest arms suppliers to these countries? It is Russia. Russia supplies very high sophisticated weaponry to India, fully knowing that our major concern is with China. So the world is building in such a way that nobody can claim exclusive loyalties. Multipolarity means that you have to constantly look at flexibility. You cannot claim exclusivity. Exclusivity will take you in the direction of being an alliance member. You cannot be an alliance member of anyone because you get locked into the problems that they have. And the fact is that internal strength has to come up. There is no alternative to creating our own defense, our own economic strength, our own national domestic stability strength to take on China. Countries in the world, multipolar, you can operate multipolarity in a sense, through that the deterrence pressure on China can be increased. And I think our foreign policy is trying to do that. We are members of BRICS, SCO, and RIC, but yet we are engaging with the Indo-Pacific, we are engaging with Quad, we are engaging with the European Union. So we want to give expression to multipolarity, and multipolarity is good. Multipolarity is good because you have your options increase. Imagine for a moment there is unipolarity in Asia. It will be dominated by China. We will get suffocated. Obviously, that is not something that we can accept. And I don't think India is too big to be suffocated by any country. But the direction in which we go is to create more and more options. And in this creation of more and more options, one of the most reliable partners from the past is Russia. Russia may not be able to solve all the problems for you like they were much more powerful in the past. They are less powerful now. But still, they're very substantial. And I greatly appreciate the comments made by Mr. Vadhavan, very perceptive comments on the international system and on Russia's position. You see, some countries, small countries cannot be strong beyond a point. Some big countries like Russia cannot be weak below a point, whatever happens. You see, Russia collapsed twice in the last century. Between 1917 and 1921-22, when the Civil War was between the revolution and the Civil War, Russia does not exist. It was chaos in Russia. It again happened in 1991-92. Russia bounced back in 1992 after the Civil War. Russia is now bouncing back. And the multipolarity in the world is unthinkable without Russia. And Russia is too big. I mean, you look at the enormity of the size of Russia. If Russia collapses on the Eurasian continent, the country that is best positioned to take advantage of that is China. Now, why would we want that to happen? On the contrary, we want Russia to be strong. Russia wants India to be strong. And I think that we can take forward. Mr. Gopalan, our distinguished ex-secretary, had put in a question, Nandan, I'll just answer that question. He had asked about this fifth generation aircraft cooperation that we had with Russia. Sir, first of all, good evening to you. This was a project that we had pursued for almost 15 years. But later on, I think there was a feeling in India that the cost imperative was becoming too much. Now the position is that the project has been formally shelved. There is enough confidence in our defense establishment that we will be able to master the critical technologies to take forward the fifth generation aircraft variety. And maybe there is some hope and confidence in that. With regard to critical materials, yes, of course. The Russians have just not only inducted the Su-57, the Sukhoi 57, which is their fifth generation aircraft, and they have used it in Syria, they have used it in different parts of the thing, so it's battle tested. But they've also created a export version. It's called Su-75. Instead of Su-57, it's Su-75. It is on offer to India. But I think our side is still looking at it. But I think there is a very strong inclination within India that we should go along the route of Make in India program. So I would think that finally what will emerge is that it will be our project, and we might take some technical assistance in some areas, say from our friends from Russia, if it comes to that. Presently, that is not the case. So we are essentially proceeding on the direction of a national program for the fifth generation aircraft. I will stop.
Thanks, Ambassador Varma. Thanks a lot. This is I didn't get the latest information on this. Thanks for giving me the latest information. Thanks a lot.
Sir.
Thank you, Ambassador Varma. I think you've partially answered Mr. Vadhavan's question also on China and how far we go. I actually have now a question to Mr. Vadhavan. Since you've been, well, at least till 21, you were in the middle of all this, the Indo-Russian trade relationship. It is something that Ambassador
My
Varma
question has been
raised.
answered.
Hello. Okay. The question that was started in my mind by Ambassador Varma, he mentioned the engagement of private sectors. You mentioned the underpinning of the private sector in Russia. What is it, in your opinion, since you've been in the thick of this, that has prevented Russian private sector from engaging with Indian or vice versa?
Yeah. So, we historically had very close trade ties with the Russians. We had the rupee ruble arrangement earlier. And of course, that was kind of administered trade, which has its own weaknesses. And since then, we are resorting to more market-based approaches. So, of course, Ambassador Varma mentioned some of the constraints, constraints of connectivity. Russia is located in a part of the world where its center of gravity, as you observed, is towards Europe and now shifting towards China. So all those factors are challenges. We don't have a trade relationship with them, a trade agreement with them. That, of course, there's a negotiation which is going on for trade arrangement between India and the Eurasian group. And that will, of course, lower barriers and lower tariff barriers. We were very keen that services should be a part of it, but they are not ready to negotiate services as a group. So services would happen individually. So somehow, in a more market-based time, the natural linkages Russia has are elsewhere. We have a lot of affinity with each other based on our historical relationships. And I think this trade agreement we should expedite. That will reduce barriers. And there has not been a culture of business to business engagement between India and Russia. Since it was all administered, trade through government agencies largely, there's no culture or history of business to business arrangements. We must grow those business to business ties. We are not on each other's radar screens as far as the business sector and the private sector is concerned. So, during my time in commerce, we had Russian delegations coming, we had some of their businesses coming, but somehow there was no, natural organic link with them. So I think what we need to do is sign the trade agreement, focus on, business to business events so that we create awareness. And I think in this age, a lot of IT-based interventions are possible. A lot of virtual interventions are possible to enhance awareness of each other's capacities. So we are just not aware at a private sector level, as far as our industry associations are concerned. There is a complete lack of awareness as to what the Russian business sector looks like, what are their capacities, which are their big companies, and they've also now not had a tradition of investing abroad, given their history as a socialist republic, and recently found sort of faith in the private sector. So they also have not been very outgoing beyond, I guess, Central Asia and their zone of economic influence. So I think all these things will be overcome with time, but we must make proactive efforts, sign the trade agreement, create business to business awareness and engagement, and I'm sure that will go a long way in promoting investment from there and from India, of course, IT sector, etc. There's huge scope for investing in Russia, and I'm sure there might already be a significant Indian IT presence in Russia. So all those, possibilities and potentialities can be grown with time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We are running towards the end. So I want to ask the big question, the biggest question that is in everyone's mind today, and it will be addressed to Ambassador Varma. I'll put it very short in just a few words. Is a war likely between Russia and the West over Ukraine?
Well, a war cannot be ruled out, because in any situation when there are multiple players and very high concentration of forces, and it is not just a open system of troops being deployed across one border. There is irregular forces in the western part of on the eastern part of Ukraine. There is the issue of cyber attacks. There is the issue of irregulars. The United States and Russia, I think, are determined not to allow it to disintegrate into armed conflict. For Russia, their victory will be 50% of victory has already come. Benefit has already come because it has got NATO and the United States to start talking. And let me explain this. Russia has been making the proposal that is finally made for at least 2 years in some form or the other. Nobody was willing to talk to Russia. Then they said, we'll give it in writing, you give us a response in writing. Initially, they said they'll not give you a response in writing. Now they've given it in writing. They're studying it. Some, in a sense, jugaad might be possible. The United States definitely does not wish to have war with Russia. Ukraine is the biggest European country, apart from Russia. Ukraine is huge. And the number of troops that they have on the ground of NATO troops are not sufficient to take on the forces that Russia has put forward. Secondly, if war breaks out in Europe, the United States will get enmeshed. It will be, as I've called it in my Hindu interview in article, it will be the mother of all quagmires. The United States will be stuck in Europe for the foreseeable future. It will not be able to take on their additional responsibilities that they see as a global power in areas which concern us, including the Indo-Pacific. But there are smaller European countries which feel that Russia should be pushed back decisively because they fear that if Russia is not, so to speak, taught a lesson, Russia will repeat this again. So there are a number of players. Of course, India's position, very rightly so, has been explained in the Security Council by a permanent representative, is that we support peaceful resolution. We have an interest in a peaceful resolution. And there is legitimate interests on both sides. Russia has definitely legitimate security interests. You see, we should understand that a country like Ukraine is to Russia what a country like Pakistan is to India. If it becomes the hotbed of external pressure on you and a constant level of hostility, so any neighboring country that becomes a base for external pressure on you, I mean, it is, we faced that problem for so long. So my own sense is that there are strong forces, incentives for not going down the path of force. But finally, as in life, in situations of war, the law of unintended consequences always is operating. You have to be very, very careful, exercise great caution and control on both sides. It's not just control on one side; it's control on the other side as well. And there are no two sides, as I was trying to explain. There are several sides to this, and not everyone has an equal incentive to avoid casualties. But if war does break out, I think it'll be quite a negative development both for European security and for global security.
There are two questions. One is, I think Malini Srinivasan had raised her hand, and Lakshmi Narayan has asked a question. Is a Cuban missile crisis like end inevitable? That is, the West or NATO give up something like they gave up missiles in Turkey during the Cuban crisis. So if you'd answer that first, Ambassador Varma, then I'll give the floor to Malini Srinivasan.
Yeah, you see, interestingly, there are two parts to this. One is a confrontation, and the Cuban Missile Crisis was actually resolved through a process of a larger modus vivendi. Khrushchev put missiles in Cuba, the Americans backed them off. The Russians, the Soviets agreed to withdraw missiles from Cuba, and there was an arrangement that the missiles in Turkey that the Americans had would be also phased out, and finally, it's not fully comparable, but I think the intention is for the two countries to find an arrangement that will firstly save face for both, reduce the in-the-face military confrontation that is coming up. The Russians have very clearly said that they are willing to do such an arrangement. They have given three basic proposals. One is no NATO expansion, no offensive weapon deployments in countries which have joined NATO after 1997, and no deployment of intermediate range nuclear forces in Europe. And the Russians are prepared to do that. I think there is a possibility of an arrangement coming about, because the Americans initially said no discussion. Now they are saying, okay, we will discuss, if not nuclear, conventional, some amount of verification is possible. So I think it's there. Interestingly enough, President Putin, in one of his interviews over the turn of the year, said that the United States and NATO are at our doorstep. We have no further place to go back. And he compared it to a spring. You push a spring right to its limit. The only way the spring can react is to come back and bounce back. And he has himself said that Russia will use asymmetrical measures. Similar, if you come to our doorstep, we will find, that is, Russia will find ways of going to the doorstep of the United States. Now, so, this again brings up the issue of spheres of influence. All big countries, all self-respecting countries should have a sphere of influence. This so-called liberal discourse says that no country has a sphere of influence. They actually mean that countries like us should not have a sphere of influence, and their sphere of influence is the entire globe. Meaning of sphere of influence is that in your neighboring countries, there will be no activity that is inimical to your own interests. Your neighboring countries need not be under you. It need not be a relationship of domination. But definitely, they should not become a platform for in our case, anti-India activity anywhere in our neighborhood. So if we are a big enough country in South Asia, we deserve a sphere of influence. If Russia says that in Central Europe there's a sphere of influence, it is understandable. If the United States says that the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean is a sphere of influence, it is eminently understandable. But if I claim a sphere of influence for security reasons, I think it is only natural that you concede the same point to the other.
Thank you. And I will now pass on the floor to Malini Srinivasan, I think, had raised a hand. Is there a question still? If there is no question, then there is a comment in the question answer session, which I would suggest Ambassador Varma looks at, although there is nothing to answer there because that's a comment. And with these words, I thank both the participants, both the panelists, for very enlightening discussion and presentations, which I think cast a lot of illumination for all of us on a fairly difficult subject and a fairly murky subject. As Mr. Raghavan had said in the introduction, not many of us are aware of the intricate details. And with these words, once again, thanking you for a very lively discussion, I hand over back to Mr. R.K. Raghavan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Krishnan, and I must thank Ambassador Varma and Vrindavan for illuminating exposition on a very complex subject. I have the privilege of summing up what happened this evening. That's a very difficult task. I tried to take down some notes, but far too many views and far too many very persuasive arguments. I don't think I can discount any of the arguments put forward by each one of you, the three of you. So I have a very difficult task. I don't know where to begin and where to end. But I must admit that very fascinating sharing of experiences by three experts who know Russia so well. So we listened to all three of you with great admiration and learned a lot. We have learned so much about the Russian scene, particularly Ambassador Varma gave us so many details, especially the one that Russia is the largest country in the world in terms of geography. That's again a revelation. We thought China competed closely with Russia, but Russia is even bigger than China. So we learned so much about the current Russian scene and its economic strengths and weaknesses. There are so many imponderables in the current international scenario. There's no longer unipolar. It's a multipolar world where each country wants to jockey for position. in spite of the multipolarity, there is a positive perception about Russia and India, like it or not, since our independence. Russia, the Indians, average Indian has a very positive perception of Russia, that it's a reliable partner, reliable country, to which, of course, there are the current international scene. There are limitations to which the country can, a country can help another. And that's now we have seen the conflict with regard to Ukraine. So Russia, yes, will certainly help us in many areas, especially in our relations with China. But then to expect it to go beyond a certain stage, it's futile. It's an imbecile response to a very complex situation. This has become a very significant factor in our foreign policy projections, but particularly with regard to Chinese growing hostilities. Of course, as some of these speakers, especially Ambassador Varma and Dhawan said, we have to build our own strength. And that's what the present government is doing. We cannot be weak. We have to be strong. Not pretend to be strong. We have to be strong. And you can't criticize the government for flexing its muscle, acquiring new weaponry. And I'm happy that so we treat every country equally. We are not superior to any country. We are not subordinate either. And so Ambassador Verma's response to the question whether there will be war on the Ukrainian issue, it's very interesting. Nobody can predict what's going to happen, but Ambassador Verma said, yeah, the chances are very high. I hope he is proved wrong, but he should know Mr. Putin's mind. There is a saying that nobody can read Putin's mind, and so we don't know who is going to be right. Anyway, on the whole, it's a fantastic evening with each of the three experts giving their views on what Russia is and what Russia may do and what Russia means to India. So I have nothing more to add except to thank the CIC for inviting such distinguished panelists from whom we learned a lot, and we look forward to seeing them again on the CIC forum and hand over the proceeding to Chandramouli.
Thank you very much, all of you. The panelists have been, the distinguished panelists have been very informative, and the audience has been a quality audience which has really stayed throughout the program. And I take this opportunity to thank Ambassador Varma, my good friend Anupa Dhawan, and Sri Nandan Krishnan for putting together such an informative panel. I thank Mr. Raghavan for his conduct of the entire program and for introducing the panelists. We look forward to more interactions with all of you. And I do invite you to attend our next program, which is next week. On the 11th of February, we have a book discussion on the new BJP by Nalin Mehta. And there again, we are putting together a distinguished panel. And I'm sure all of you would enjoy listening to the panelists next week. So till then, thank you for joining and goodbye. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.